All right, welcome everyone to our character creation lab, writing student and working parent characters in partnership with Imaginable Futures. My name is Dustin Fleischman. I'm the director of events and communications here at the Writers Guild Foundation. So, before I introduce our moderator, I'd love to share just a brief intro about the WGF. For those of you who don't know, we're the nonprofit arm of the Writers Guild of America, and it's our mission to preserve and promote the craft of writing for television. So we host public events just like these, panels, workshops with writers and industry experts. We also have community programs that help kickstart writers' careers, and we have a bunch of phenomenal resources for the greater writing community to tap into. You do not need to be a member of the WGA in order to take advantage of our resources. Probably our biggest one for those who live in or are visiting Los Angeles is our script library at the Writers Guild headquarters. It is a free service that's open to the public by appointment only, and it houses tens of thousands of scripts from produced movies and TV shows. So it's a great research library. Everything I mentioned, as I said, is open to the public. You don't have to be a member. You can learn more about the library and everything that the foundation has to offer on our website. I will throw those links in the chat for you. So if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. Subscribers are the first to learn about events just like these and much more. Um, Definitely hope that this isn't your first time using Zoom, but did want to remind everyone joining us here, if you have a question for our panelists, please direct it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. If you ask the question in the chat, there's a good chance that it's going to get lost in the mix. While you're there, also make sure to enable closed captioning if you need to. So it is available by hitting the show captions button again in that bottom Zoom toolbar. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Jenn Clark, over at Imaginable Futures. Jenn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dustin, and thank you to the Writers Guild for hosting such an exciting conversation tonight. I'm Jenn Clark, and I lead strategic communications for the US team at Imaginable Futures. If you don't know who we are, Imaginable Futures is a global philanthropic investment firm with teams in Brazil, Kenya, and the US focused on equity and education. In the US, we invest in solutions that reimagine the possibilities of education and caregiving, renewing the promise of our childcare and post-secondary education systems as engines of family opportunity. What we found over the last several years of investing in this area is that time and time again, parents of young children are forced into making a false choice between education and family. Parents make up a sizable share of post-secondary students in the US. They represent 1 in 5 current US college students and 12 million more with some college experience but no degree. These learners are driven by dreams for a better future for their families, but are often held back by fragmented systems that fail to recognize their dedication as both caregivers and students. These are motivated, talented students who make the same grades as non-parents despite significantly greater demands on their time, attention, and money. Yet most never graduate. Why? What is standing in their way of their success? Well, most colleges don't even ask students about their parenting status, and many programs established to support working parents exclude those pursuing education. Underlying all of this is the childcare crisis in the US, which affects both working and student parents. These are the cracks between our systems of learning, care, and work that millions of US families slip through, rendering them invisible to those who make decisions that shape their lives and their families' futures. So why a character creation lab? Working families have long been fertile ground for American storytelling. And what are the fresh, modern ways to interpret or update these stories for a new era? Today, we will look through the lens of working families with parenting students as a starting point. We'll look at some compelling and acclaimed stories, and hopefully some of the things we'll cover today will spark some ideas for your content and development. And it's not just me or the panelists you'll hear from, or even you who are joining us tonight who want to hear more stories like this. Research from New America's Better Life Lab and MarketCast found that 84% of TV viewers say they are interested in seeing more depictions of work, family, and care that are realistic. These are stories of resilience, hope, and the American dream. And most importantly, they are common stories that do not often get the Hollywood treatment. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, who I'm really excited to hear from tonight. First, we'll have Michelle Denise Jackson, who's a Writers Guild of America award-winning writer. She received her MFA in writing for screen and television from USC's School of Cinematic Arts. Since 2019, she has written on some of the most popular and critically acclaimed shows of the peak TV boom, including Generation on HBO Max, Pieces of Her on Netflix, critically acclaimed limited series Maid on Netflix, which we'll hear more about in a little bit, the NAACP award-winning drama series Queen Sugar on OWN, and Apple TV's flagship drama The Morning Show. Since 2020, she has served as adjunct faculty in USC's John Wells Division of Writing for Screen and Television. Next is Madeline Hendricks Lewen. She's a TV writer and playwright. She currently serves as a producer on Sci-Fi's The Ark. Other TV credits include Freeform's Good Trouble and the CW's Jane the Virgin, where she worked for all 5 seasons. Her plays have been published by Samuel French and produced in New York and LA. Anya Meksin is a TV writer for the Hulu limited series We Were the Lucky Ones, the Netflix series In From the Cold, and the new hit ABC series High Potential. She is also in development on her sci-fi project Taminex, which was selected for fellowships and labs at Film Independent, IFP, Screencraft, and the Blacklist Women in Film. Anya was born in the former USSR and immigrated to Columbus, Ohio as an asylum-seeking refugee when she was a child. She received a BA in literature from Yale University and an MFA in film directing from Columbia. She also has many more awards and recognition for her projects that range from short films to documentaries. I encourage you all to read their full bios online, especially if you're looking for your next great TV watch. So with that, I'm going to tee up a little bit more of the context, and then I promise I will turn it over to our panelists to jump into the discussion. So we're exploring how to make characters multidimensional and captivating by using research, experts across issue areas and populations, and working with individuals with lived expertise. And we're doing this through the lens of a really inspirational population who embodies the American dream. So in addition to the stats that I laid out a little bit earlier, a bit more just to lay the groundwork. Student parents are not a monolith. They're as diverse as America. They're primarily students of color, primarily women, veterans, first-generation students, and they're all ages of students. I said earlier that 1 in 5 college students are parents, but this is an especially common experience for Black and Indigenous students, particularly moms. 40% of all Black women currently enrolled in college are parents. 2 in 3 live near the poverty line, and they experience high rates of food and housing insecurity. 38% of parents said they considered dropping out in the last 30 days, and most don't complete the degrees they start. But in my 15 years of working with this population, I can tell you that it is not for lack of trying. They display extraordinary resilience and dedication, but a relentless grind of systemic roadblocks, like the lack of institutional and policy support and the rising costs of college and childcare, undermine their pursuit of a degree or training that leads to a better life for themselves and their children. And as an example, single moms who graduate with a college degree earn $625,000 more over their lifetimes than with just a high school diploma. They may not know that exact dollar figure, but student parents know at a deep core level what a degree would mean for their family's futures. And that's exactly why they enroll. So now I am going to bring our panelists into this. And Michelle, I'd love to ask the first question to you. We at Imaginable Futures are such fans of Maid, and we've worked with Stephanie Land in the past, actually, because her second book is called Class, and it's about her experience as a student parent, takes place after the events of Maid. And Maid came from source material, her memoir, Stephanie's real life experience. And so how did you tackle, one, translating the book to the screen, and then 2, collaborating with Stephanie, the real life inspiration beyond what was written in the book?
Yeah, so I have to give so much praise to Molly Smith Metzler, who's the creator and the showrunner of Made, the TV show. I was so blessed to work for her. She's an incredible artist. She's an incredible working mother herself. Um, and she did a lot of work, to build Stephanie's trust before the room even started and to do a lot of research. Anyone who's read Maid, it's impossible not to be affected by the memoir. Stephanie's story is just like so raw and emotional, and she's a fighter, but she's also like, I shouldn't have to fight this hard. Nobody should have to fight this hard. And I think that was one of the things that we really wanted to explore in the show, and show the link between, emotional abuse and what that looks like through the lens of domestic violence, which people often don't consider domestic violence, and also how that is linked to, um, you know, living below the poverty line in this country, and how those cycles kind of reflect each other, and how it gets really easy to be stuck in these cycles, not because you're a person who feels victimized, but because the systems themselves and abuse itself are built not to like allow people to feel agency, to feel empowered. And so I think understanding that was like the core of trying to translate, you know, Stephanie's memoir to screen, like really understanding who she was, the journey that she went through emotionally, the absolute love that she had for her daughter at the time. She now has, I think, 2 or 3 children, and how much her love and her responsibility as a parent was driving her, and then wanting to really say something. And so like it always, and I'm sure, Madeline and Anya can agree, it always comes back to emotional. Like, what are you trying to connect? How do you want people to connect to these characters emotionally? And so that was that, but also what are we trying to say about what the various ways that abuse can look like, for a person, as well as what it looks like to be trying to get your head above water when a system is made to constantly drown you, basically. And so like those were kind of the starting points. And then again, through Molly's leadership and the support that we had from our producers and our studio and our, Netflix as our other, studio partner, was just really kind of building the story. And so even though like Molly went to and the show is at Port Town. Like you work on so many shows, and they all kind of blend together. But I think the real show, on the show, and in Stephanie's memoir, that town is Port Townsend. So like Molly went there and like walked through the town that Stephanie lived in with her and did all this research. And Stephanie came to visit the room at one point and tell us more stories about her life and her child. Who now goes by a different name. And again, all the things are blurring together. I also just got back from the wedding in Mexico yesterday, so please excuse me from like don't know where I am. But that was all really integral to wanting to get the story right. Like Stephanie was a real person, her family were real people, the experiences she went through were real. But I think one of the things that helped us when we decided to make the show inspired by and not based on. So there's a difference. It was our interpretation of Steph's story, not just us, recreating Steph's story for the screen, allowed us to have a little bit more freedom to maybe tweak some of the events, the order of the events, combine characters, because we only had 10 episodes, because Steph's book is so sprawling. It's multiple years of her life. And so that ended up, I think, understanding that core emotional thing that we're trying to get to, understanding what we wanted people to understand about these experiences thematically, caring about Steph, but also understanding the responsibility that we had as writers to tell this story, I think helped present something to the world that I'm incredibly proud and lucky and blessed to have worked on. I hope that was a good answer.
It was a wonderful answer, and I hope someday to hear more about the wedding in Mexico, but for another day. So I want to turn to you, Madeline, because Jane the Virgin is such an iconic show, and it's actually one of my all-time favorites. It's also so tonally different from Maid, and one through line of the series that was consistent throughout was Jane's commitment to both her role as a loving parent and her dreams for herself. So it was her dreams for her family, but also her dreams for herself. And holding both of those equally was often the narrative driver of the show. And the love triangle, of course. This to me shows how student parent stories can be told in such different ways. How did the role of comedy allow you to explore some of those tough life challenges? I mean, Jane the Virgin really covered a lot of territory. And navigating unexpected parenthood with dreams of higher education and becoming a writer. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, similarly to what Michelle was saying, I have to give major praise and love for the showrunner, Jenny Snyder-Urman, who I was very lucky to work with for all 5 seasons of Jane the Virgin. And she really had such a clear understanding of the tone from the pilot that allowed us to tell so many different kinds of stories and not get too overwhelmed by, different like tonal changes that we didn't know what was going on. Like it was really her voice throughout that allowed us to make the show what it was. I think it's so interesting hearing about Maid, because talking about having to like take a book and turn it into 10 episodes and really pick and choose your stories and combine your characters. Jane was kind of the opposite. We were like 22 episodes a season, 5 seasons long, like old school, CW. So we were really able to dive into so many different kinds of stories, and the comedy helped so much to be able to tell stories that I think either in some ways might have felt, preachy, or like we're really trying to jam home a message or something, but you can tell it in this entertaining, light story with, Rogelio de la Vega and some of our favorite characters that can really and played so brilliantly by Gina Rodriguez and everyone in the cast, that we were able to tell stories that were powerful and meaningful, but hopefully in the moment felt light and entertaining. And then later you could kind of think about them more. And that's my favorite kind of comedy to write, that in the moment you're laughing along, you're not really thinking about it. And then maybe the next day that story actually stayed with you and touched you in some way you didn't quite expect. And I think the show did that very well. And again, it wasn't just the comedy, it was also the fact that we could, I think in TV, especially today, we as writers, or at least I know I am sometimes scared to tell stories that are too small, because we worry it's not going to get a big enough audience and we need to have these huge twists in order to keep people watching. And with parenting stories specifically, like sometimes the small stories are the ones that hit home the most. And I mean, Maid did that so beautifully in so many ways. And I think with Jane, we were able to do that because we had this whimsy and we had this fantastical element of the show, and we had this soapy telenovela element that we could always end on a big cliffhanger, which allowed us to tell stories about like Mateo's ADHD, or the time that Jane has to be a teaching assistant for a bunch of like athletes that she doesn't relate to, or these sort of smaller stories that could just be very emotional or funny or, whatever, but on another show might be harder to tell. So I think that was really the gift of Jane that I think back on a lot in the years since, that like, God, we were so lucky we got to tell so many stories, especially parenting stories, because of the tone, because of the comedy, because of the whimsy. And the last thing I'll say about it is, I remember on season 1, I was Jenny's assistant. And then I worked my way up on the show, and I was a producer, I was a writer, and I kind of got to see it from different angles. Season 1, I very specifically remember the show was getting a lot of buzz, and there were a bunch of like interviewers asking Jenny, questions about where season 2 was going. And so many people were saying like, now she's going to have the baby, and like, what's going to happen? Like kind of in a tone of like, is the show just going to be boring now? And Jenny was like, what are you talking about? Like, this is the beginning of the show. Like, she has a baby, and Jane as a character is just going to become more complicated and more interesting and more dynamic. and she's still going to be sexual and she's still going to have romance in her life. And like, because she becomes a mom, that doesn't make her character less interesting. It actually makes her character more interesting. And it certainly gave us more stories as writers. There were more comedic moments to lean into and so much more conflict. To be a person who wants to be a writer and who goes back to school for that and is now balancing that with motherhood. I mean, Jane always had two stories, like an A story and a B story, you know, because there was so much to tell in that. And so, you know, it's just something to remember as we think about what kind of stories we want to tell, like becoming a mother, becoming a parent. It's just, there's just more there in a great way because there's more conflict, and conflict, you know, gives us more. And I love the fact that on Jane, she wanted to be a writer from the very beginning. She became a mom. Her dream stayed the same. She still wanted to be a writer, and there were challenges to that, but she ultimately did it. You know, it's a very beautiful thing we were able to do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Oh, it so does. I really like love what you said around the small moments being like some of the most like emotional ones. I mean, even we were talking earlier around how some of us, our parents, have like new kids. And for me, you know, I have a toddler, and you know, him yesterday sitting on my bed while I'm doing laundry and him like reading a book, I was like, I am mom of the year. Like I felt like a literal triumph that was just so small. And then, you know, the thing also that really always gets me working on student parent stuff is that it's like you have a kid and your potential evaporates when actually your motivating force has just entered the universe. And that to me is like what I think institutions of higher education, policymakers, a lot of people just sort of miss that parents are now doubly motivated. And speaking of potential, I'd love to now turn to Anya and bring you in because on High Potential, which is one of my favorite new shows, is that we see a single mom of 3 kids who's trying to make ends meet by working as a cleaner for the police on crime scenes. But then, as it turns out, she has a really high IQ and really high quote unquote potential that proves to be indispensable when solving crimes. And there are a few really interesting choices, character choices that I think the show makes. But one of them that I thought was just so great was depicting the father as a real hands-on caregiver. And I want to acknowledge that this panel is all women, so it's an all woman panel. But I think that it's really important to bring fathers into the conversation because although student parents are more likely to be moms, there are more than 1 million student fathers out there who are navigating these flawed systems too. And they're also navigating really outdated norms, gender norms around fathers as caregivers and providers. So Anya, I'd love to hear more from how you've seen making some of these seemingly unexpected choices and characterization really opening up some of the possibilities for you as a writer. And then how do you know, writers make sure that their characters are not defined by any one set of circumstances or sort of stereotypes, whether it's a backstory or a current story arc?
Yeah, I also love, you know, Morgan as a character, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to write on that show was because of the portrayal of this mother who was, you know, neurodivergent. She's kind of a mess, but she's a badass. Like she's not perfect. She's not a perfect mom. She's not a perfect girlfriend, wife. Like she's not a perfect employee. Like there's so much imperfection and mess and chaos that felt so real to me as a working mom myself. And, you know, the struggle of also trying to be a perfect mom is like you feel like you're failing so much of the time because of all these demands on you from every direction. And I love that that was like such a big part of the character. So I completely agree that that's a wonderful, you know, aspect of the show. You know, um, High Potential actually is a European show that what is like a big hit in France. And it was adapted for American television. And I actually find that really interesting because the character of, Ludo, the working dad, who's like, they're actually separated. They're not together anymore, but he's still like, he's so comfortable with his masculinity that he's still there, like taking care of the kids, allowing her to pursue this huge new opportunity professionally. And I'm like, would we have been allowed to create this character in America? Because, we inherited this character from another society that has very different laws and protections and systems in place for working parents. I mean, parental leave and, guaranteed parental leave for both men and women in France is a very different thing from what we have here in the US. And I think there's just a lot, politically that has been completely accepted as a right and a norm and a necessity for a functioning society that here, not only are we still fighting for, but we're going backwards in. So that is one of those things that we actually inherited from the European version of the show. And there were times, during the making of High Potential that, we kind of like wanted to push the envelope of that. And, can we get away with her having like a boyfriend while also having her ex, like helping to take care of her kids? Like, what can we get away with? And so that was always like a conversation because, our audience is it's a network show. So our audience is very mainstream, diverse, like big swaths of the American public. We have to be able to appeal and we have to walk that fine line. So, all of these questions are political in nature, really, as well as, social and, so those were always really important questions for us. And one other thing about High Potential that I find really interesting in this regard is that, High Potential is very aspirational. And I would say it's even very like escapist in its kind of wish fulfillment fantasy about what happens to a brilliant cleaning lady, who's a working mom who like this woman gets noticed for being a genius, right? And they're like, you should come help solve cases for us. And like, I think part of like the poignancy for me with that character always was that a lot of the women watching our show never get to have that experience of someone being like, you know what, you're a cleaning lady today, but I see how brilliant you are. And I want to offer you these other opportunities to come and help us because we need your talent. And instead, I think, as we know, a lot of women and parents and, people in circumstances where they're doing a job that is not a reflection of their potential and their talent. And there isn't anybody holding out a hand to give them that opportunity and that support and that recognition for how much potential they have and how talented they are. And I think that's one of the reasons the show really appeals, is that it has this wish fulfillment and that people, want to go on that journey through the show because that's such a hard journey to go on in our own lives and in reality. And that's a heartbreaking thing. And, that's why we always took it really, really seriously, even though it's like a very lighthearted murder mystery. But we were always super serious about the fact that, she's doing this for her children. This is an opportunity for her to change her life. And the cases that she cares about, the cases that we chose as a writer's room, were cases that were a reflection of the fact that she's an underdog. She fights for people who are, on the margins of society, like she herself has been on the margins of society. She's neurodivergent, so she understands not being appreciated and not being successful within the systems that have been set up for kind of, mainstream success. So all of these things were super informative in our writing process all the time.
That's so fascinating. I also sort of really related to what you were saying around how some of this it almost was like a coincidence that her potential was discovered, right? And I think that is the case for a lot of parents, student parents. I mean, I hear stories all the time around, they got a $500 emergency scholarship or emergency aid, something or other, to help them get their car repaired so that they could get to class on time. And because of that, they were able to graduate and get their degree. And it's just sort of like, that's leaving a lot up to fate for a lot of families. And so that really resonated. Michelle, I want to bring it back to you, and I have sort of a two-part question, but I think they really go together. One thing that I often hear from audiences about this topic in the past is that it's too complex, that there are too many stats, too many different issues colliding at once. Maybe some people thought that in my opening preamble, but one approach to really exploring some of those thorny and overwhelming societal issues is to do so through the lens of a single person's story, or a single person's experience. But that can have drawbacks too, especially when we're talking about big societal issues where it could be reinforcing the issue as being just one person's problem versus a collective problem that we sort of all as a society need to wrestle with. But I felt like Maid really didn't fall into that trap. The conversations that I saw sparked by the show really grappled with the systemic nature of both domestic violence and also economic precarity, and how they, often go together sometimes. So two-part question, but one, how do you approach weaving together those larger societal themes in the context of a single person's story? Like, what are you thinking about as you're trying to do that? And then secondly, the show really did have a lot of a high audience engagement on social media in particular. And I think because it was touching something that it wasn't just about a single person's story. So what kind of characters, what kind of stories do you think really was driving that? And apologies if that was too much into one question, but I do think they go together.
Okay. I think I'll remember, and if I don't, I will ask you to remind me. So the first, when it comes to like how we were able to kind of take all of these things and still make it feel relatable, even though we were just with Alex's story inspired by Steph's story, is it was a real intention behind it. So Alex is in every single frame of Maid. It is very much her story, which is an incredible feat for Margaret Qualley to do as an actress. She never got a day off. And I think part of that was the intention of like you really feeling this character under pressure all the time. But I think also, it allowed us to show those parallels between the cycles of domestic violence and emotional abuse and the cycles of, like you said, economic precarity and, relying on government systems that are almost designed not to help the people they say they're helping. And the show does that in so many different ways. I mean, you see Alex herself kind of she cycles through homelessness at one point. She cycles through all different types of government assistance. She cycles, it's that thing, but also she goes back to, the person that she leaves in literally the very first scene of the pilot, because there's nowhere else for her to turn. And then you also see it portrayed in like she has a friendship with another woman who when she's living at a women's shelter, who goes back to her abusive ex. There's her own mother who's in this very toxic, very unhealthy relationship, who can't get herself out of that and also can't get herself out of homelessness. And so I think again, we tied it. It was so emotional. It was so about this character, but it was also about these relationships. And like, no one is a villain. Like, no single person is a villain in Maid. Like, even her, her child's father, who she has to share custody with, and he has been emotionally abusive to her. He struggles with alcoholism, and that alcoholism is in response to abuse that he witnessed and suffered as a child growing up, and alcoholism that he witnessed in his own home. And so it was really having a very humane response to like when people are in these situations, when people are in pain, um, oftentimes they commit more pain, and it's making an excuse for abuse. Like in the show, it's like he has to get help and all those things. But I think one of the issues with where we're at right now as a society is that we have lost our ability to see each other's humanity. And there should be accountability for when people are doing wrong, absolutely. But if we lose track of someone's humanity, then we're kind of part of the problem ourselves. And that's generally what I feel. And I was very grateful to Molly that she wanted to take this very balanced approach to these characters. So I think there's that part of it. um and obviously, emotional abuse is very different than physical abuse or sexual assault. And so I think we were also playing with not a softer, but um a more nuanced territory that honestly hasn't really been portrayed on television. And so that was allowed us more ground to cover in some senses. And then I think in terms of like audience engagement, I try really hard not to go online and see what people are saying about the shows I write on. It could just be a very slippery slope. Um, but Maid was one of the rare ones that I did, and it was interesting because, and also it would be interesting to see people being like, "Wow, I experienced this growing up with my mom as a child," or "I know so many people like this," and so there was that aspect of it. I think there was that aspect of it. Even myself, when I read Steph's book, and then when I went online and saw how people were responding, I didn't grow up in economic precarity. Like I have two parents who are educated. I went to private universities, um, and so I think a lot of people just don't understand what it is like to live below the poverty line in this country, what it is like to be, like that $500, that $1,000 medical bill away from being unhoused. And so I think a lot of people it made a really big, complicated issue feel personal for them. And I think that is absolutely the power of what we get to do as storytellers, especially in a visual medium. Um, and then, one of the most meaningful things for me for Maid is I also work part-time as adjunct faculty at USC. And 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, time is fake. I was teaching a class, and one of my students in one of her essays talked about how she was a working mom and how Maid really impacted her. And to have this student in my class who it was just really moving. And so I think the thing that I've really taken away from the show is because it was so deeply personal, because we really showed the full spec. And Alex is not a perfect character either. Both Madeline and Anya were saying, she's complicated. Most of the social media was like, why is she doing that? This girl needs a break. She's making bad decisions. And it's like, yeah, when you're under pressure, sometimes you make bad decisions.
Yeah.
But she was also doing the best she could in the moment. And so I think, a lot of people related to that intensity of this character's experience, because it was emotional, it was personal, it reminded them of someone they knew, reminded them of their own experiences, and it was really a gift to be part of that experience.
That's awesome. Madeline, back to you. I think, getting sort of more into the nitty gritty of the writer's craft, and I'm seeing some questions come in that are sort of looking for more advice around this. But when approaching studio notes and revisions, and this sort of goes to what Michelle was finishing on, but did executives pitch anything that would have impacted a character's authenticity that you felt was really important to get right? And then how did you go about navigating that situation?
Yeah, on Jane, we were with the CW as the network, CBS was the studio, and there were some other producers on the project. And I have to say they were really supportive and really understood the show. And again, props to Jenny, who created the show, who they trusted so much, and also the writers that she hired, I think were so, not talking about myself, they were so smart. But I mean, the group of people was, you know, people from all different backgrounds, people from all different life experiences who could make sure that we were telling the story in an authentic way. I think that allowed the execs and the studio and the network to really trust us. I mean, I remember in the early days, it was always just the classic network note of like, can you make sure that Jane is active in every scene, constantly just making sure she's active, which like, it's an easy one to roll your eyes at, but at the end of the day, like, it's a great note. You know, it's one of those where you kind of are like, this is annoying, and then you go back and it always makes the show better, because especially with a show like Jane, where this is about a woman trying to figure out how to take her life into her own hands in a wild situation, especially in the first season. So there wasn't anything where that they, you know, gave a note that we were like, absolutely not, we can't do this, because I feel like we were all very much on the same page from the beginning. And on other shows that I've worked on, it usually always just comes back to having a conversation. I mean, obviously, if there's big creative differences between like the network and the creator, things like that, then things can go very, very wrong. But usually in my experience, and especially on just like pilots I've worked on myself, if the note is not, if the note doesn't feel right, there's usually a note behind the note that is right, you know? And it's so funny, like, I don't know, Anya and Michelle, if you guys agree, but I feel like in a lot of my own projects, if I write like 7 drafts of a pilot, I'm always going to send the 7th draft out as my sample, even if I didn't agree with every single note along the way, because it's always an excuse to understand the characters better, to make the story sharper. And so it always just gets better for the most part, for me at least. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, I think it's more, you know, like getting being in the mindset for feedback, I think is like is part of it. It's always devastating when like you get a note that is annoying and you're like, but it's right.
Exactly. And I mean, being a writer, especially in TV, you kind of have to be a collaborative person in that mindset, because if you're going to be fighting your producers or your network the whole time, you're just so screwed. Like, you just kind of can't view it like that. So
Yeah.
I think it's always better to try to have an open mind and be creative about the note, even if you don't exactly agree with how they're putting it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So Anya, I'll bring it over to you. You know, we're talking about a population that's sort of like it exudes sort of the American dream ethos. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about your own experience, which sort of is another like American dream story that's rooted in the dreams that families have for each other. How does your perspective of acclimating to a new country after displacement inform some of the characters or the stories that you write about or that you're drawn to?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think that I would have become a writer if I hadn't had that experience as at a formative age, as a child, you know, leaving behind everything I knew with my family, going to a new country, all of those dreams, putting it, you know, like it was so palpable that we were like leaving everything in order to pursue what you know, was such an aspiration of my parents, and something that I grew up hearing from them, that the US was this place, you know, where we would be accepted despite our, you know, ethnic background, despite our religion, we would, you know, have opportunity. um and then I think coming to the US and discovering that, you know, there is no such thing as a perfect place. There is no such thing as the city on a hill where all your problems go away. In fact, you know, as a very young child, I was 7 years old, I immediately kind of experienced this like really deep um, feeling of like disillusionment and kind of betrayal of like, oh no, like it's really hard here too. It's, you know, we may not be persecuted here because, you know, we're a Jewish ethnic minority, the way we were in Russia. But here, you know, we moved to Ohio, a very homogenous kind of, you know, fairly conservative place, and just being foreigners, who didn't know English. Like they didn't know that we were this or that, but we were foreigners. We didn't know English. So that was enough to experience the feeling of being an outsider. And I think that experience of being an outsider, basically pushed me toward storytelling as the place where I felt connected to humanity and to the universal experience in a way that in my daily life, I didn't feel that connection. I always felt like an outsider, but in the world of storytelling, I was an insider, right? I felt such deep identification with every novel I read, every show I watched. And I was like, these are my people. You know, the people in stories are my people because their experiences are what I'm going through. It kind of just became inevitable to become a writer. And all the characters that I write are basically, I write in so many genres, you know, sci-fi, fantasy, crime, horror, like I've tried every genre, it feels like, but I'm always coming back to female characters that are outsiders and that are survivors. And these are women that are through the narrative, through the function of story, through the experience of story, discovering their own strength and discovering capacities that they didn't know they had. And so it's almost, no matter how old the character is, it's always almost a coming of age, because it's always this process of coming into your full personhood and fully discovering what you're capable of in this life. And that's like my inspiration as a writer. And I think I'm very inspired by my own mother, who really held our family together during our immigration. And our immigration process was very drawn out. We were like refugees in Europe for months, waiting for visas. We didn't know where we would end up. And here's this woman, my mom, holding together 3 children, her in-laws, because my father's parents were on the immigration journey with us. So she's taking care of these elders. She's taking care of these children. She's taking care of my father, who, you know, is clinically depressed and has a lot of mental health needs. And she's just doing it all and managing to then start a brand new career. You know, she has a PhD and was a scientist in Russia. She started over in America. And she always did it with like such an understated like grace and love and kindness. And that's a character that just always inspires me. Like I always come back to that. And then, you know, you seek the ways, for me, through genre and through like surprising, like fun story twists and suspense, you seek the ways to make that fun and to make that entertainment, because, you know, nobody wants to like engage with like material that is just preachy and just social issues and just, you've got to make it like a riveting experience, whether that's through humor or through suspense, you know. But the starting point is always that emotional authenticity and that emotional truth that is the reason we're all doing this, you know. And if you don't have that piece of it, I think it's like kind of an empty exercise. But when you do have that piece of it, like that is your inspiration for everything. And I'm, you know, I see in our comments how people on this chat and in this webinar are like from all over the world with such a huge range of life experience and like life concerns and things that you've been through. And like, that's your incredible superpower as a writer, and to lean into that and to just like authentically tell the struggle that only you can speak to, I think is a superpower in the writer's room when you're pitching these kinds of stories, is to just speak from a place of total authenticity and, you know, honesty. And also when you're developing your own material, to develop, you know, or get staffed, it's like, come back to your truth, because it will inspire a life of art.
Shout out to your mom, first of all, like, yay.
Thank you. I love her so much. She's coming to visit me from Ohio in a few days, so I'll tell
Oh,
her.
yay. You can share the recording because that's, I think every mom would want to hear that. So we have a bunch of questions that are flowing in. So look, and they're great questions. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move right into them and ask you all a few questions that we got in from the audience. So the first one is from Vicky Shabo. Shout out to Better Life Lab at New America that's done all of that great research, has lots of great resources on work and family issues. And she says, I love Jane the Virgin example and the Morgan examples from High Potential of how mothers can be full humans. Like what a concept. And in High Potential, how Ludo is also a full, competent human as a parent and a person. And she asked, I'm curious whether there are proof points that you would use to compel showrunners or other shows to include these nuances that make the characters interesting and authentic. And Anya, that can be for you, or it can be for Michelle and Madeline and any of your other experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost like that's kind of what we were just talking about, is that like when I'm in the room, it's the most compelling pitches are always the ones that are coming from a real place and like have that spark of like detail that is just, you can't make it up. Like there's just something about it that's like, oh shit, that's amazing. Like did that really happen to you? And those are the things that kind of work their way into the show. And that's why it's so amazing to have a diverse writer's room, because like every writer has to bring experiences that no other writer can contribute. And I have found that, you know, the 3 showrunners that I have worked with have been incredibly open to those stories. And, you know, it's just, they're still not, you know, the gender parity, and there's a lot to wish for with our industry. And so maybe there's not the opportunity that we could be seeing, but I think showrunners are very open.
Yeah, I have a slightly different answer just because I think it's all like I think it's always important as a writer to pitch things that you care about that feel emotionally real to you, like 100%. I also think that it can be really challenging as a writer when you're on staff to sometimes like certain characters, certain stories don't fit into the show that you're writing. And that has been a really big challenge, is like you might feel really passionate about something, but for whatever reason, whether it's, you know, studio mandate or your showrunner, it's just not, it's not the right fit. And so I think sometimes it's always important to like take the like, this is something important, bring it to the room. You know, I think oftentimes, like Anya was saying, the proof point is a lived emotional experience. It's not like data or, you know, it's never that. It's never that. It's usually like, it's the thing that if you get emotional or you're laughing about it or you're excited, then everyone else in the room becomes excited about it too.
Yeah.
But also sometimes even the things you are most excited about never make it onto screen, and that's okay. And so I also want to uplift for other people, you know, in the chat. Sometimes like you don't have to give everything to the show you're working on. Put it in your pilot, put it in your novel, put it in your feature. I think that is just as important as trying to get these stories told in other people's work. Like the goal and the hope for many of us is to be creators and showrunners and or whatever equivalent of that exists for us. And so like that's also just as valuable, because again, if that is authentic and it's emotional and you're excited about it and you write this thing that is undeniably you, that is what people respond to, and then that's what a studio wants to buy and make. And so you're doing the work in that sense as well. So like definitely agree with Anya in so many ways, but also just a reminder that sometimes it's not going to be right for the show you're on, but it might be right for the show you create.
Yeah.
I very, very much agree with that, with what both of you said. I think just a quick addition, being a writer on a staff is very different than writing your own thing. And it is a delicate balance of those two things of what you guys were just talking about, of like trying to tell authentic stories. And also you are trying to service the showrunner's needs and vision. And so we could have a whole other panel about that, but it's you're always sort of balancing those two things. So um I just agree with everything said.
Madeline, I feel like you really queued me up for one of the next questions from Rita, who's an emerging screenwriter, and she was curious to learn more about using smaller moments that we were talking about before for characters as the most emotional and powerful ones. And how do you go about setting a scene like that up? And I'll just even add to that what you were saying around balancing some bigger vision with some of those like small moments.
Yeah, it really depends on the show you're on, right? Like I'm on a sci-fi show right now, and a lot of the times like I come at it from a much more like rom-com place because that's like my genre usually. And so oftentimes I'm thinking about the relationships or the romance. And if I want to pitch something, I have to find a way. I mean, my showrunner is amazing and the writers I'm working with are amazing. So I can just talk and we'll figure it out together. But, in certain instances, if you want to be strategic about a pitch, you might try to say like, there's this sci-fi moment that we talked about. There's this moment that we know we need to get to by the end of the episode. And what if there's this romantic moment between, or this beautiful parental moment, or this very small relationship moment that I've been trying to get in the show that could really be the perfect beat to get us from here to here. And that's so much of what being a writer is it's kind of like math, right? Like it's emotional and it's also math. It's kind of like being an architect where there's like the design element and then there's also just like the literal, how are you going to put the structure together? And so I think with anything, whether it's trying to figure out how to get those little moments in or whatever it is that you're passionate about, that you're trying to get into the story, it's a puzzle that you're trying to piece together. And it can't just be a series of little tiny moments usually in TV. Some shows you could get away with that, but usually there's a certain level of plot that needs to happen. And again, it really depends on the kind of show that you're working on to figure out how to like get those moments in there.
Amazing.
I agree with that. I also think that like a small moment still should have big emotional impact. And I think all of our shows kind of reflect that, right? And Maid itself, it's not a big story, it's not this grand sweeping narrative. It's about a single mother in a small Washington town who's cleaning homes to try to take care of herself and her child and try to get, back to school. But like some of the most kind of impactful moments are those really small moments, because like that's what life is made of. Life is not made of the graduations and the weddings and the da, 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 da. Like it's made of like what you were saying, of like watching your toddler on your bed as you're folding laundry, like reading this book, and like I'm your kid probably is a genius but also might not be reading yet. But the fact that he has, or they have, this curiosity about the world and is like probably like emulating something that you do with him every night from this place of love, I feel like is that it's like that, like, oh my God, like punched me in my chest right now. And I think that's it. Like when we talk about small moments, it's like I think we're saying human moments, like where this character is fully a person, but the emotional impact still has to be big. Mostly because at the end of the day, our job as writers is to not be boring.
Yeah. I kind of love that note to end on. And I'm also sorry because we had a couple of really awesome questions that we didn't get to. A couple of them asked for some resources. So I will say that I volunteer to work with Dustin on maybe putting a couple of resources together that when we send out the recording, we can include a couple of links for folks on the call who are eager to learn a little bit more or dive into some of the craft pieces. But I really, really want to thank all of you for just like really lighting up my night and for sharing your insights and your stories with me and with everybody who joined. I want to thank the Writers Guild for like creating this container and creating the space for us to have this conversation. And then most importantly, I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight and all of those who will be joining and watching the recording for taking like time out of your day. I know there's literally so much vying for your attention these days. And so, we really appreciate it. And if you ever, want to explore more of this intersection between education, learning, care, please reach out. I'm Jenn Clark at Imaginable Futures. Thank you so much and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.